I want to ask you something uncomfortable, and I want you to really consider it before you answer it. If Jeffrey Epstein were alive today, should the US government be allowed to execute him? Should he have been killed legally by the state? Here's why that's a difficult question. Even if you're someone who opposes the death penalty no matter what, Epstein feels like an exception. A man accused of trafficking and abusing underage girls, ruining countless lives, and getting away with it for decades. If you oppose the death penalty, do you oppose it even in his case? And if you do still oppose it in his case, is there a crime horrific enough that might make you reconsider? And if your answer is you would execute him, I have a follow-up for you. Are you comfortable handing our justice system, the same system that gave Epstein a sweetheart plea deal back in 2008, the power to decide who lives and who dies? Let's work through the arguments together and I'll offer my opinion. Because this isn't really a video about Jeffrey Epstein. And it's not even really a video about the death penalty. It's about what happens when our morals and ethics are called into question in the most extreme circumstances. Before we get too philosophical, let's do a quick recap on who Jeffrey Epstein was. In case you've been living under a rock, Jeffrey Epstein was a wealthy financier accused of sexually abusing and trafficking underage girls. In 2008, he cut a plea deal with the state of Florida for lesser charges, instead of facing federal charges that would have put him away for life. Basically, Epstein worked the system and it was an incredibly lenient cop-out for him. He ended up serving just over a year in jail with 6 days of work release every week. Most of his victims felt like they never got real justice. Then in 2019, federal prosecutors arrested him once again, this time on sex trafficking charges. And for a moment, it looked like he might finally face the accountability he dodged for decades. Then, before trial, he mysteriously died in jail. Whatever you believe about if that actually happened or how that actually happened, one thing's for certain for a lot of Americans, it felt like Jeffrey Epstein got off easy once again. When people picture the worst of the worst, the kind of offenders the death penalty was supposedly built for, they're often picturing someone exactly like Epstein. A wealthy predator using his power to prey on vulnerable people, even children, for years without consequence. That's what makes this question worth asking. Not because Epstein is some unique case, but because he forces us to confront how far our principles will take us. First, I'm going to briefly go over the argument in favor of executing Epstein, because if the death penalty exists, who's it actually meant for? A supporter of executing Epstein would say something like this: some crimes are so catastrophic, so irreversible in the damage they cause, especially when the victims are children, that life in prison just isn't sufficient for justice served. They might even say that someone operating on Epstein's scale poses a real ongoing danger to society, and therefore we shouldn't risk ever giving him another opportunity to victimize people. Others frame it less as revenge and more as a statement society has to make that some lines once crossed will result in dire consequences. And to be clear, polling backs this up. Support for the death penalty consistently spikes whenever there's a horrific crime committed, because the question stops being abstract and becomes something personal, something more visceral. For example, in cases such as school shootings, there are often renewed calls to reinstate the death penalty for the shooter. The public see the grieving mothers and the tiny corpses, and their principles are called into question. I oppose the death penalty full stop quietly turns into, well, maybe except for this one. Maybe your own answer shifted the moment I said his name. I have to say, I've grappled with my own principles around this topic when it comes to Jeffrey Epstein. For a lot of people who oppose the death penalty, the argument is simple. The state should not be killing people. Not because the crime isn't horrific, and definitely not because they don't deserve it, but because there's a difference between punishment and vengeance. The question I always have to ask myself is, can we really rely on stopping violence by committing violence, i.e. executing people? This is related to the argument of deterrence, the idea that having the death penalty on the books might stop someone from committing a violent crime. But decades of research and studies show consistently that murder rates are often higher in states with capital punishment. And this is the argument that I think holds the most weight. The system failed to act when it came to Epstein several times. They handed him that 2008 plea deal. That same system protected him for years and failed his victims time and time again. And that same system would also be the one deciding whether or not he should die. Zoom out and that becomes uncomfortable fast. Because the death penalty has never been applied to members of our society equally. Who actually gets sentenced to die often comes down to where the crime happened, how wealthy the defendant is, the quality of their legal team, their race, and local politics. Two nearly identical crimes can end up with one person sitting in prison for the rest of their life and one person being executed. You have a guy in Alabama facing execution who never killed anyone, and then you have some monstrous acts of violence like the Parkland shooter who shot 17 high school children facing life in prison. Ultimately, the death penalty is not dished out evenly or fairly. And now for the argument of innocence. And I just want to be clear. I know Epstein is 100% guilty and nobody is trying to dispute that fact. But the moment you build a system capable of executing the worst of the worst, you also have to accept that that imperfect system will sometimes get it wrong. On my channel, I've covered an array of possible wrongful conviction cases, and one thing is for certain: wrongful convictions happen. Over 200 people have been sentenced to death in America for crimes they never committed. They've been proven innocent and later released from prison. And once someone's executed, there's no going back. No appeals, no redo. An execution is final. We know for a fact that America has executed innocent people in the past. I personally don't trust our system to get it right every time. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't look at someone like Epstein and question my own principles. But if my answer changes depending on who the defendant is, maybe the question isn't, did Jeffrey Epstein deserve the death penalty? Maybe it's whether justice should be built on principle or emotion. Emotional justice feels satisfying right up until the state gets it wrong, or applies it unevenly, or decides that someone you didn't think deserves to be executed crossed this arbitrary line. History suggests that happens more than we'd like to admit. Tell me where you land. If Jeffrey Epstein were alive today, should he have got the death penalty? And more importantly, why? Because I bet your answer will reveal much more about how you see justice than it does about how you see Jeffrey Epstein.